Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bridge the Gap 2021. And I am so delighted to be your host today. My name is Lee Hendricks, and I'm the International Curriculum Manager for the middle years from Fieldwork Education. I will be your host today, and before we begin, we'll start with some housekeeping issues to be aware of. So first, if something goes wrong at any time, you might want to refresh for the platform. And you can also send your questions throughout our discussions and our presentations today. We'll have approximately 5 minutes between presentations. If you wish to review any or all of the wonderful content from the speakers, we will give you the link after the event. So we have lots of people joining us from around the world today, and we are honored that you have taken the time to connect and join us for Bridge the Gap. We also have a great lineup today of speakers that I am sure that you will enjoy. So we have Margaret Andersen, who's from the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab. We have Tony Wan, Head of Investor Content from Reach Capital. We also have Dr. Jaime Saavedra from the Global Director of Education of the World Bank. Mark East, the General Manager of Education Division of Microsoft. We also have joining us the Global Teacher Prize winner of 2018, Andria Zafirakou. We have Natalie Wexler, who will be joining us, who's the author of The Knowledge Gap. And closing today, we will have our remarks from the founder of Sophia School, a School of the Future International Academy, Konstantinos Doukas. So I would just like to say thank you very much for taking some time out today, and we have a great lineup. Please stay with us. You can send us any questions. Do your best to be patient as we put your questions together, and we'll answer as many questions as we can in the lineup. So joining us for our first presentation today is Margaret Andersen. Margaret Andersen is a Senior Policy Associate at Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab, or JPAL, and she will be presenting today, Defining the Problem with our Bridge the Gap. So we warmly welcome Margaret Andersen.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Lee, and for inviting me to participate in this event, George and Natasha. I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to share some of the emerging evidence in education and to hear from all of you today. I will assume, unless any of you stop me, that you can see my screen right now that has the presentation, but please holler in case something is not working. For those of you who are not familiar, I'll start today with a brief introduction to JPAL. JPAL is a global research center headquartered within MIT's economics department with 7 regional offices around the world. JPAL's mission is to reduce poverty by ensuring that policy is informed by scientific evidence and that research is translated into action. At the heart of our approach is the use of randomized evaluations, also known as randomized control trials, or RCTs. Randomized evaluations are one type of impact evaluation method used to measure the impact of social programs and policies. For the sake of time, I won't talk more about these now, but would be happy to describe them further if of interest during the Q&A. At JPAL, we work with a network of more than 200 of the world's foremost development economists, who are united in their use of impact evaluations to generate evidence on effective approaches to reduce poverty. We at JPAL focus specifically on their randomized evaluations. Our network of affiliated researchers have now carried out more than 1,000 randomized evaluations in 88 countries around the world. That research falls into the 10 sectors you see listed here. Today, we'll of course focus on evidence from the education sector, one of our largest sectors at JPAL. Our network has nearly 270 education-related evaluations in almost 50 countries in many regions of the world, as you see on the map here. At JPAL, the education sector is led by 2 academic co-chairs who are experts in education research and who guide all of our work. JPAL's local grounding is critical to the success of our work. As briefly mentioned earlier, we have 7 regional offices and many more satellite offices around the world. Our teams in these offices understand local issues, local contexts, and local languages, and they form close relationships with partners like governments, advocacy organizations, and NGOs to help map evidence to the priorities of the partner and to build up a culture of evidence-informed policymaking in these places around the world. So how exactly does this work? At JPAL, as mentioned earlier, we conduct randomized evaluations to evaluate programs and policies that seek to reduce poverty. From there, we seek to disseminate this evidence through policy outreach with policymakers, donors, and practitioners in conversations like we're having with all of you today. We complement this outreach with targeted capacity building so that these key stakeholders can better understand and use the evidence, ultimately leading to more evidence-informed decisions moving forward. Now, moving on to the crux of today's presentation, I'll start by briefly describing the global learning crisis and educational context we're in, which most of you are quite familiar with already. Before the coronavirus pandemic hit in early 2020, the world was already experiencing a learning crisis. Although primary school enrollment had risen to more than 90% in low and middle income countries, students were struggling to learn. In Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, for example, 3/4 of grade 3 students could not read a basic sentence in 2014. And in rural India, half of grade 3 students could not solve a 2-digit subtraction problem in 2018. And the coronavirus pandemic is exacerbating this learning crisis and widening learning gaps around the world. As many of you have experienced firsthand, COVID-related school closures have affected approximately 94% of the world's student population. And experts predicted that the share of children below minimum proficiency levels is expected to increase by 25% due to the pandemic. Additionally, learning inequality has increased, with the most disadvantaged children and youth facing the largest learning deficits, given differential access to remote learning and home conditions during school closures. A year and a half into the pandemic, many education systems have reopened, some fully in person, some fully remote, and others in a hybrid format, as you see on this map here. Students, teachers, and government officials are facing a radically transformed educational experience. The rest of this presentation highlights some of the evidence on how to address these varied models of reopening so student learning actually improves as students are back in the classroom. Now that we've outlined the learning crisis, what can we do to combat it? I'll spend the rest of the time today sharing research insights in a few thematic areas related to improving learning that we think are particularly relevant post-COVID. These topics include parental engagement, shifting business as usual instruction, and education technology. To start with the evidence on engaging parents or caregivers in their child's education, something that can be done while schools are still remote. To share a bit of motivation, parents and students often lack key information to make well-informed decisions related to education. For example, choosing which school your child will attend is a big decision, and parents might not understand how the choice of a specific school today might affect their child down the line. Additionally, students may not have examples in their lives to demonstrate the wage returns to education, especially when the cost of staying in school may feel much higher than dropping out to get a job. These gaps in knowledge vary in content, but they exist across contexts. As such, making sure that parents and students have access to the information they need to make the best decisions is a key part of supporting student learning. One way to address these knowledge gaps and potentially curb learning loss during the pandemic is by providing parents with actionable guidance on how to be involved in their child's education over the phone. I'll start with an example from Botswana during COVID school closures. In partnership with Young Love in the Botswana Ministry of Basic Education, researchers identified households willing to receive remote learning support via mobile phones. Students in households that received weekly SMS text messages with a series of numeracy problems of the week, paired with 20-minute phone calls with Young Love staff who walked parents and students through the problems, increased their math skills after 12 weeks. In another example from the United States, conducted prior to the pandemic, parents received 2 texts per week encouraging literacy activities during the summer when kids were out of school. You can see here on this slide an example of a text sent through the program to give parents a concrete idea for an activity that they could do right now to encourage literacy for their child. This program also had positive results. It increased learning outcomes for children in grades 3 and 4. In both of these examples here, parents became more engaged in their children's education, and they had a better understanding of their child's learning levels. Shifting gears now to working with students in the classroom, I'll share some evidence on changing business as usual instruction. When thinking about strategies to improve student learning, providing inputs is an obvious and an intuitive place to start. Perhaps learning isn't happening because of limited resources in schools and classrooms. However, many studies have looked at adding inputs in low and middle income classrooms, like textbooks, flip charts, adding teachers to reduce class size, etc. Consistently, these studies have showed no impact on learning. Test scores did not improve. Even when schools were provided with cash grants to spend on things they needed most, there were no lasting gains in learning. So the key takeaway is that while school-based resources and inputs are necessary to providing education, they're not sufficient to ensure learning. And if adding inputs are the only changes being made to an education system, learning likely will not shift. However, research does show some promising results when inputs are linked to pedagogy and school governance changes. For example, when hardware, technology, is combined with personalized software, pedagogy. One example of this is the MindSpark evaluation in Delhi, India. Developed by educational initiatives, MindSpark is a computer-assisted learning software that provides students with personalized instruction. The software delivers customized content targeted at the child's level, and it dynamically adjusts to the student's progress. This program was delivered after school, and it provided students with 45 minutes of the personalized software and 45 minutes of instructor-led small group instruction. This program increased learning levels across all groups of students, regardless of their initial achievement, gender, or wealth. After 4.5 months, students had 2 times greater improvement in math and 2.5 times greater improvement in Hindi. Building on this last example, which personalized instruction to each student's learning level, there is a broader body of evidence in education which supports this idea of targeted or tailored instruction programs. 15 randomized evaluations in Chile, Kenya, Peru, Ghana, the United States, and many from India all support the finding that tailored instruction is one of the most effective and cost-effective ways to improve learning outcomes. Different models of tailoring instruction have been found to be effective, both during and after school. And evidence suggests that the teaching itself can be done effectively by tutors, by volunteers, by teachers, or through education technology, as we just saw in the MindSpark example. Here, we've mapped a number of these programs together using a rough and admittedly arbitrary cutoff line meant to give a sense of practical significance of magnitudes. You can see that these programs consistently had positive impacts across contexts. One such example is Indian NGO Pratham's Teaching at the Right Level, or TARL approach, which divides children, generally who are in grades 3 to 5, into groups based on their learning needs rather than their age or their grade, dedicating time to foundational skills rather than focusing solely on the curriculum, and regularly assessing student performance rather than relying only on end-of-year examinations. Over more than 15 years, JPAL and Pratham have partnered to rigorously test various versions of the TARL approach, as you see here on this chart, identifying 2 models ready for scale, which are now reaching students in India and 11 countries in Africa. Now, to just briefly touch on education technology more broadly, something that we can leverage while schools are remote or while they're in person. I'll summarize some high-level takeaways drawing upon a review paper written by JPAL in 2017. The main takeaway from the evidence is that EdTech is only as effective as the mechanism it is helping to deliver. It's not the education technology itself, but how the technology is used by parents, schools, children, and how it's incorporated into the classroom. To break this down further, first, education technology alone is not effective. This fits with our general lesson that access to educational inputs alone does not necessarily increase learning on its own. Second, computer-assisted learning that combines hardware with effective pedagogical software is more promising. This aligns with the MindSpark example, which also ties to our broader lesson on tailored instruction. Third, technology-based nudges ties into the lesson on parental engagement and how sometimes providing people with information they didn't have before can increase learning. And finally, here are a few key takeaways, mostly from studies in the United States about online learning, which we won't discuss in depth now for the sake of time. Here's a quick summary of what we discussed today. I won't go into detail about this now, but happy to discuss anything further in the Q&A. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to hear your questions and learn from all of your perspectives.
Thank you so much, Margaret. That was really informative. And I mean, what you said was so true. It's not about just having technology, it's how it's implemented, how it's used. And I think that's a very important point. And the parental engagement is so important that if you lack information, if you get more parents involved and you have them, whether that's through text message, phone calls, or either through the internet, whatever means, you're going to see success. So that was great sharing your stories, your results there. That's incredible. We have 2 questions for you that have come through in the chat. The first question we have for you is, what do parents need to have in mind when choosing a school these days? What should they have in mind?
That is a really good question. Thank you very much for asking that. I am not a parent myself or an educator myself, so I may not be best placed to think about this, but you know, there are 2 sort of subsets of outcomes we think about when we are talking about educational outcomes. The first is thinking about outcomes on school participation. So whether or not you have students actually attending schools once they're enrolled. And then the second set of things we think about is learning. So more of the topics that I covered today. And so one sort of thinking about the first set of educational outcomes on school participation, I think sort of keeping in mind access as you're looking at schools. If you're thinking about the transportation costs of getting to school, if someone is not feeling well on a certain day, or if it's really hard or inconsistent to be able to actually get to school, then it might lower people's attendance and then therefore ability to learn while in the classroom. So I do think it's interesting and important to think about the ability to access these schools. And then, can you still hear me?
Yeah,
my
we
screen
can
just shifted.
you.
Okay.
We have a second question as well for you.
Oh,
sorry, did you want to finish there? Go ahead.
Yeah, so basically just thinking about access, thinking about your child's goals themselves, communicating with schools to understand what the classrooms look like, what the educational goals look like, and to see if the teachers would be able to sort of provide more of a tailored instruction, I think is something that I would find particularly useful, to have an understanding of whether or not teachers are teaching sort of to the curriculum, to the test, or if they can really focus on your child's needs and where your child is a second thing I would consider.
Great, great. Thank you for sharing. The other question we have is, what happens in communities where parents have literacy issues themselves?
That's a really good question. And so a lot of our researchers actually think about this in close partnership with people who are on the ground, often NGOs who are implementing programs or education systems themselves. And so as we are thinking about designing interventions to reach parents and to provide additional information, literacy is super important. So first we need to consider, if we're trying to reach people via the phone, who has access to a phone. And in the case that someone may not have a phone, we may want to try other modes of getting out information, either through community-wide engagement, through pamphlets, through other ways to connect with community members. And then when we're designing interventions themselves, if we're designing them targeted at communities where parents do not have high literacy, then it doesn't make sense to send text messages that are written, because the parents would not be able to understand that. So in those cases, you could consider having a phone call, making sure someone speaks the local language that the parents speak as well, and you can have that conversation, or again, have other community outreach. But that's a really good question, and literacy is something very important to consider, and also something to think about is, if parents haven't had access to education themselves, they might not themselves understand all of the benefits of education. So really just trying to make this as salient as possible in an accessible manner can help assist sort of children in their learning experiences.
Well, Margaret, thank you so much. We do have one other question, but we'll see if we can have some time a little later from Ben Davis, and we'll see if we can come back to you, okay? Thank you so much. We're going to move on to our next presenter, because we're chock-a-block. So very, very nice. Thank you very much for sharing. So next, joining us is Tony Wan, who is the head of investor content at Reach Capital. He's going to start our presentation today with education's new virtual reality. Thank you very much for joining us today, Tony.
Thank you, Lee, and it is a pleasure to be here. I hope that you can all hear me. Tell me if not otherwise. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining from. It is a pleasure to be here today. My name is Tony Wan, and I'm the head of investor content at Reach Capital. We are a venture capital firm that invests in the education sector from early childhood through K-12, higher education, adult learning, and workforce development. And it's a pleasure to share some high-level thoughts on some of the K-12 and higher education trends that we are seeing. So let me pull up my slides. Give me 1 second. Can you all see this?
Yes, yes, we can.
That's great. Thank you, Lee. All right. So at Reach Capital, we are investors, but before we were investors, many of us were former classroom teachers and former entrepreneurs building education businesses. I was a former journalist at EdSurge reporting on the education technology space. And so we very much approach our work from a lens on the impact that our work has on students and teachers. Generally, when we think about education, it has a reputation for moving pretty slowly, but, due to the pandemic, never have some of these changes that we've seen in the past recent years felt so fast. The reality is that the pandemic has really accelerated fundamental shifts in how we live, how we learn, how we work. And as investors, the pace of change is thrilling, but as parents and former educators, it is also a wake-up call to some of the new challenges and outstanding inequities that persist for many teachers and learners. And so earlier this summer, we put out this report to document these challenges, and some of the lessons that we saw and that we learned are ones that we think will fundamentally change the future of teaching and learning. And I'm honored to be invited here to share some of the highlights today. So last year, as schools closed, many teachers and students went online to continue some semblance of instruction. This resulted in a dramatic increase in the use of the number of educational tools and websites in order to keep some instruction going. Some of the most popular resources were things like Google Drive and Wikipedia, along with some edtech products like Khan Academy and Kahoot that really have a global footprint across schools and at homes. Some of the biggest surges that we saw were in tools like Google Classroom and Zoom that made it possible to keep some semblance of remote instruction going. Google Classroom, as one example, grew nearly fourfold in terms of the usage. Zoom education users made up 50% of all overall subscribers in less than 3 months during the early months of the pandemic. So we saw how technology was able to fill a critical, some of these critical gaps, but more so in more of an emergency and a response setting. We also saw tools like ClassDojo that served as an important communication platform that kept teachers, students, and families in touch. And others like Nearpod were proved to be an essential way for teachers to be able to deliver engaging and interactive content to students. And similarly, they both saw a pretty dramatic spike in the amount of usage that they saw. There were some learning activities that happen in day-to-day classroom that translate easily online. There were reading content on platforms like Newsela, and also digital study apps and flashcards like Quizlet that also saw a pretty tremendous uptick in new signups and new active users. Now, as investors, I think all of these numbers would generally make most investors happy, but one of the things that we know is that the accelerating use of technologies did not always make students and teachers' lives easier. Overnight, many teachers had to learn how to teach and learn how to use online tools effectively, which of course, I think many were not properly prepared or trained for. And as a result, there were some challenges. One of the biggest challenges that teachers reported was keeping students engaged and motivated. The lack of hands-on learning opportunities made many lessons and projects difficult to carry out. And it was also difficult for teachers to really assess, the students' emotional cues that you would normally pick up in a face-to-face setting. It was really hard to do that online. One of the biggest issues that concerned us was the increase in mental health problems, such as loneliness, depression, and suicidal, thoughts. And survey after surveys of parents and students found that the isolation that was caused by the pandemic really exacerbated mental health problems, which of course then affected many students' ability to focus on learning and academics. It is hard to focus on learning content when a lot of your other basic life needs and social needs are not being met. And for teachers, the overnight shift to remote learning, really, caused a lot of burnout and stress. Prior to the pandemic, teaching was already a pretty stressful profession. And for many teachers, some of these new responsibilities really pushed them over the edge. One survey found that teachers had about twice the rate of extreme stress as the average adult and 3 times the reported rate of depression. Now, despite these problems, we also want to acknowledge that technology can play a role and be effective at enabling human connections and social experiences in ways that may not have been tried before in many schools before the pandemic. One of the most popular ed tech services used around the world that I mentioned earlier is Kahoot, which lets students and teachers create learning games and challenges that they can play in social environments. Another company called OutSchool offers an online marketplace that connects teachers with kids for live small group online classes that are based around academics and hobbies. And so one of the important shifts that we saw is that a lot of education technologies in the previous days were really focused around passive learning and content consumption, but we also saw instances of tools that can enable new kinds of connections and community-based learning, as long as they are designed thoughtfully and with a pedagogically informed approach. We also saw that many schools are working with education technology companies to make on-demand 24/7 access to online tutoring available for all students. And we think this is a game changer because in the past, one-on-one tutoring was largely limited to families who can afford it. But by making the service available through schools and districts, it can make tutoring more equitable and make a difference in helping students address learning losses from the pandemic. Now, one of the biggest and perhaps the most appropriate concerns around technology is how much time kids are spending in front of screens. During the pandemic, to no surprise, the average screen time for kids doubled from 3 to 6 hours, and the percentage of kids spending more than 8 hours also greatly increased. Now, one of the assumptions is that they are just passively consuming content online. And that may be true for many kids, but one of the things that surprised us was that this wasn't the case. And in fact, kids also found ways to do productive things as well. One of the phenomenons that really caught me by surprise was the emergence of this platform called the Study Web, which is a collection of popular platforms like Discord, TikTok, and YouTube, where kids are actually coming online to study together. So they're recreating study groups in the library, but doing it online, in front of a computer. And we thought it was pretty interesting. Many kids are also building and creating things online as well. And in some cases, they're even making money from, selling things that they're building and selling. One of the most popular destinations is Roblox, which offers an online game creation platform where many kids can create and share games and also participate in a virtual economy. And there's also another platform called Replit, which is a browser-based coding environment that allows kids to collaborate and coding projects. So, these are instances that offer a lot of promise and potential in the ways in how kids are gravitating naturally towards online platforms to do, build, and sometimes sell things in ways that are productive. Now, given the acceleration of these technology trends and as COVID continues to impact how schools operate, we expect that students and families want and will have more options for how and where they learn. Over the pandemic, we saw that many families want remote learning to be available as an option, and that some say they may stick with it indefinitely. Some of the common reasons why parents say, have that preference is that they say that, the kids and children feel safer. We do have to acknowledge that unfortunately schools are not always safe or welcoming environments for every student, that bullying, for example, is a problem. And that there continues to be some health considerations. I think that we all hope that that the COVID situation will pass, but we think that in the near future, the continued evolution of some of the strains, as well as immunocompromised families and populations, will demand safer learning environments. Now, one of the barriers to making remote learning work has been a lack of computers, devices, and broadband available in order for students and teachers to access the online tools and services in the first place. Before the pandemic, in a developed country like the U.S., as many as about 30% of U.S. K-12 students lack the means to access digital learning at home during the early days. But thanks to some major technology investments from both the public and private sector, we saw a concerted effort to procure devices and broadband. In the US alone, K-12 computer shipments nearly doubled year over year. And by the end of the year, nearly every teacher in surveys said that the child had access to a device either at home or at school. And in response to some of the challenges and chaos of remote instruction last year, a lot of schools are beginning to invest in training and professional development to help teachers get up to speed on some of the new digital tools that they are asked to use these days. And as a result, many say they feel much better equipped to teach with technology than before. We're also seeing some similar trends of digital adoption in higher education. In the US, one of the biggest drivers of changes in higher ed is the demographic shift in terms of who attends college. Now, we often think of college students as 18 to 21-year-olds, especially like ones that you see in the movies. But the reality is that they are increasingly what we call non-traditional students. They are often working adults who have kids, who are juggling their studies along with other responsibilities like earning money or caring for children or a parent. These are students who need flexibility in where and how and when they learn. And in response, we have been seeing colleges and students turn to third-party online courses. Coursera is one of the biggest US-based providers. In the UK, there is FutureLearn. All of them are seeing a boost over the pandemic in terms of enrollment and the learners served. Universities are also increasingly working with companies to create fully online degree programs and also shorter bootcamp-like courses for students who are looking for a quicker upskilling experience. Now, still, one of the biggest challenges for higher education these days is whether they are adequately preparing students for meaningful work and careers. And one of the biggest critiques and evidence has been that there is a mismatch between education and employment and career opportunities. As of this past June, almost half of recent US college graduates were underemployed or unemployed. One of the things that we hear often from employers is that they want to see education programs that better integrate work and learning, something more of a return to their apprenticeship-like models. And we believe that technology, there's tremendous opportunity to bridge that gap, to connect employers and students around real-world projects and provide academic credit for experiential learning, especially in a world where work is being done remotely. Now, these are just a few of the current trends and tailwinds that are accelerating seismic changes in education today. One of the most telling and one of my favorite graphs is this one, which shows how over the past 2 decades, as the cost of computing software has decreased, the cost of education in college textbooks has actually skyrocketed. Right? These are two these are two lines that are going opposite directions. And as former educators and now investors, we believe that more digital innovation and training can help temper these skyrocketing costs. Globally, it's estimated that about $6.4 trillion is spent every year in education, and the vast majority of that is on non-digital costs and services. We don't expect 100% to shift to digital, but we do think there is still a massive opportunity in the education market to grow as an industry in ways that are more affordable and sustainable for learners. So our thesis is that by embracing and investing in tech innovations, we can really help expand education opportunities and elevate economic mobility for all learners. So that's just a very quick high-level summary of this report. You can find a full report on our blog at medium.com/reachcapital. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to connecting and taking some of your questions.
That was fantastic, Tony. There was so much to take away on that. Indeed, this was the biggest experiment during the pandemic. So yes, that was well said. I found it very interesting about the study web that you also have too. I thought that was very interesting. Some of the quotes that you have about some of the students saying never felt so connected and productive based on these platforms that they're using. So, and also I think another takeaway is the infrastructure that is needed to bridge the gap, and also the effectiveness of how teachers are increasing their skills as they get more in line. So fantastic. Thank you for sharing, Tony. We have 2 questions that have come up. We have one from Ben Davis. Does Reach Capital have any interest in the development of educational tools for students with intellectual, cognitive, or neurodiversity, autism, learning issues?
Yes, we do. We believe in technologies that can really encompass and accommodate the needs of all learners. And so the most important thing is to take into account the context and the situations that different families are in. So, yes, in our portfolio, we do focus on tools that serve as particular segments of the population, whether it's English language learners, whether it's learners with special needs. We span the whole gamut.
Great. And the other question we have is, do you predict lower or higher fees in university degrees globally after a possible shift to fully online learning?
We believe that digital innovation and some of these partnerships that I shared will lower the cost of higher education. And it's not just our belief. I think that if you look at the global higher education enrollment trends, in the U.S. it has been declining, and cost has been one of the biggest factors in that the ROI is just not really there. And so even from a higher ed institution's perspective, like for their sake, I think for their survival and for their continued existence, they have to find ways to lower costs, to make it more affordable, to make it more accessible. There are a lot of, the good thing about digital innovations in this space and some of these online programs is that they're able to scale effective content and materials a lot more effectively, right? So that some of the costs that you might associate with things like textbooks, right, or other materials or other equipment, we can lower that if there is a way to distribute some of the best quality materials efficiently.
Indeed. Let's see what the future will hold there. Well, thank you very much, Tony. We appreciate it. If there's any other questions, looks like we are okay. Yeah.
All right.
So
thank you, everyone.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tony. We're going to move on to our next speaker. This is Dr. Jaime Saavedra. He's the Global Director for World Bank's Education Division. And we're very excited for him to come and explain about from learning poverty to learning of the future, charting a course beyond the pandemic. Welcome to Bridge the Gap, Dr. Jaime Saavedra.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Thank you very much, and many thanks for the invitation. So Tony was saying that we're all much better now in technology, so let's see if that is true. And let me share my screen. Okay, hold on a second. See. That's not working, I guess. Okay. So I don't know. It says that I'm sharing already, but I don't think you can see that.
We can. You just need to make your PowerPoint slide, the top right hand side, a little square. If you click on it, it will actually make it full screen. No, not, yeah, there would do. Yeah, that would work. There you go.
Great.
So all good? You can see it well?
Yes.
We can see it well, thank you.
So thank you very much. Let me see if it. I think this is fine. So thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. I want to spend a few minutes talking about what has been the impact of this pandemic in the developing world in particular. What are the trends that we're seeing? What are the lessons? And then a bit about the way forward. But I want to start discussing a bit where were education systems before the pandemic. And one indicator that we came up here at the World Bank, actually in 2019, just before this pandemic, was something that we called learning poverty, which is, if it's a simple indicator, which is the percentage of 10-year-olds that can read and understand a simple text. If you think, well, that percentage should be 0, right? In the sense that all kids should be able to read and understand a simple text by age 10. Unfortunately, that learning poverty, so that rate of children who could not read and understand a simple text, was 53% before the pandemic in 2019. That's an extremely large number, because if you think most of those kids are in school, right? There's still about 250 million kids who are in school age and who are not in school, so that's still a problem. But most of these kids, most of the 10-year-olds are in school. And despite the fact that they are in school, they are not getting the fundamental skills. And if you don't know how to read and understand by age 10, all the other competencies that we care about in education are compromised. So this is a huge challenge that we had even before the pandemic. And if you think, well, as I was saying, this number should be 0. All kids should be able to read and understand a simple text by age 10. And aspiring to eliminate learning poverty is akin to aspiring to eliminate hunger or to eliminate extreme poverty. And in a way, this very high level of learning poverty is an early warning that all goals, including the SDG 4, right, are in jeopardy. And you could say, well, maybe that number is 53% is very high, but maybe it was going down fast, and maybe that number is going to be 0 by 2030. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Even before the pandemic, we were seeing that this number was falling, so that the situation was improving. Learning poverty was going down, but at a very slow rate. Not enough in order to be 0, right? To eliminate learning poverty by 2030. So we were already really worried about this number. This is morally unacceptable. All children have the right to an education that will provide them with the skills that they need for a productive life and a productive and a fulfilling life, and to be citizens that they can contribute to the development of their countries and of their families. But it's also to a certain extent economically unacceptable, because we do have the financial and technical resources in order to eliminate this, right? It's really not rocket science, right? To make sure that all kids will be able to read and understand a simple text by the end of primary. So we were in trouble already, but then COVID came, and school closures, and this is something that all countries immediately thought of that as part of the arsenal to fight the pandemic, without really much knowledge of what was the real benefit from a health and epidemiological perspective of keeping schools closed, right? I mean, basically the economies were shut down, and including schools, except for a few countries, right? Sweden didn't close. But we didn't know at the beginning of 2020, right? It was critical to close schools, or what's going to be what was the role of schools? What were the rates of infection of kids vis-a-vis adults? We didn't know. So without that knowledge, then yeah, maybe it makes sense. And actually, but also without an internalization of the magnitude of the costs that were borne by children and youth. So as time has passed, we, at the end of last year, we did a first simulation of what might have been the impact of the school closures on this 53%. And by the end of last year, our simulation showed that this learning poverty could be increasing from 53 to 63%. Unfortunately, the school closures have been much longer in many parts of the world than what we expected, particularly in South Asia and in Latin America. Only now, between September and October, they are starting to come back to school, not everywhere, but South Asia, Latin America, parts of Middle East, part of East Asia, they are just returning now to school. So the closures were much, much longer. And actually the impact of remote learning has been relatively weak and unequal, right? So in low and middle income countries, maybe the top 10% had a connection to internet. They were the ones who, as Tony was saying, were increasing their FaceTime, the FaceTime in online, but that was the top 10 or 20%, right? You remember, you're talking about middle income countries in which internet penetration at home is 50%, right? And low income countries, that will be 10 or 20%, right? So actually the online part didn't work for many parts of the developing world. And so countries started doing radio, TV to send books at home, send reading material. So, I mean, countries tried to do their best. But despite that, the learning losses that we expect are very high because both the length of the school closure and the ineffectiveness and inequality of any attempts of remote learning. But unfortunately, it's not only about academic learning only, right? We are really living, right, the worst education crisis in a century. And from different aspects, right? Our prediction is that about 13 million more girls might marry early, right? In the coming years, we're talking about potentially 24 million additional students that will drop out of the system, and that's the whole systems from primary to tertiary education. More than 350 million kids have lost their daily school meal during this long period of school closures. There is a large increase in depression and anxiety symptoms globally. Because of this reduction in learning and potential future productivity, we expect a very large learning loss at this stage if we do not act quickly, of about $16 trillion of losses of future income of this generation. And let me emphasize this. This is not about how much economies might lose, right? No, this is about how much this generation of students might lose, because they will have less productivity than the previous generation and the upcoming generation, right? Because of their loss in human capital. And the other issue that worries us a lot is a potential inequality catastrophe. And we see this inequality impact from three perspectives. From a generational perspective, so these children, I mean, those who were between 5 and 20-something years old, during this 19, 20, 21, compared to other generations, we see an increase in inequality by socioeconomic level and an increase in inequality by educational level. And let me very quickly show three examples where we have data, which we don't have a lot, unfortunately. So this is data for the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And what you find there is the scores of 5th grade students in mathematics, which have been improving steadily until between the last decade, until 2019. Fortunately, Sao Paulo is one state who has continued measured learning even throughout the pandemic, right? And actually that we see in several states of Brazil, but we see only in a few low and middle income countries. There are many countries which are not measuring learning. Unfortunately for Brazil, we do have a measure, and by the beginning of 2021, they did a measure of mathematics, and there is a dramatic fall, right, in the scores of students. basically returning to about, it's a setback of about 10 years, right, in terms of students' scores in mathematics. We have data for the rural Karnataka in India, also showing a loss of learning of the equivalent of about 1 year. So this is really talking about this generation. So children who are in school today, I mean, might be losing a lot in terms of their own competencies. But we're also worried about what happens by socioeconomic level. And there we don't have a lot of data regarding learning, for instance, for low and middle income countries. We do have data for richer countries, right? And an analysis done for the Netherlands shows that 60% higher losses for students from families of lower educational backgrounds. In the case of UK, we also see much higher losses in reading for schools serving disadvantaged students. We see a very clear pattern in several states here in the United States, also of children of disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds with much larger learning losses. So this is only what's happening in rich countries, right? We don't have yet data yet for poor and middle income countries, but given the disparities, right, in terms of the experiences, right, comparing that kid that has internet at home, a place to work, parents that can support her, books at home, compared to that other kid that doesn't have any of that, right? A kid in rural Peru, in my country, right, that will not have any of that. The experiences are dramatically different. And finally, there is an inequality by the education level. And this is data for here in the state of Maryland, here in the US, in which here are overall literacy readiness percentages for different grades. And as you see, for grade 11 and grade 8, the loss is only 10 points, 10 percentage points. But in grade 2, it's 35 points. In grade 5, it's 23 points. So much larger losses, right, for students of in primary education, which is what is expected, right? Because older kids can have a better experience online, for instance. If we're talking about here a relatively rich state in the US, but the experience online or the experience remote can be better, right, for a student in secondary than in primary. And just think of early childhood education, right, pre-K, right? Basically, those kids, those who were 4, 5, 6 year olds, they had nothing. They had almost no education experience beyond what their parents could give them. So actually, in that regard, I mean, we need to really be worried about what has happened with younger kids compared to. So now let me focus the next few final minutes in terms of some of the lessons of the pandemic, and that this relates a bit to the some of the things that Tony was mentioning before. One lesson of this pandemic is that we need to close the digital divide in low and middle income countries. That's something that we knew before the pandemic, but now it's much clearer, right? The countries need to accelerate. And when I talk about the digital divide, it's not talking about just closing the connectivity gap. It's the connectivity, the software, the training of teachers, then the internalization of using technology in the education process, which is something it's more talking about an ecosystem that one has to create. It's not only or the hardware or the software or the connectivity. You need everything. Interestingly, at the same time that we say, look, we really can use technology and we need to use technology more, this pandemic has shown that education is a social phenomenon, right? Education is intensive in human interaction, right? Schools, universities are really a social space, right? And learning is a social activity. And it has been clear for all parents, right, that teachers are the good teachers are there not to provide just, I mean, knowledge, right? They're mostly there to be coaches, to facilitate, to inspire, right? To instill creativity, teamwork, perseverance to kids. So that human factor is absolutely essential on the education process. So at the end, a key lesson is that in the future, well, there's a future that has been propelled to today. That future is about the balance between technology and the human factor, right? This is what we'll need to aspire since tomorrow, right? Now, The other set of lessons is also related to a way to the human factor. First is that parents are protagonists of the education of their children, like it or not. And this is very clear for some parents, but less clear for other parents. So it has to be part of public policy, right, to support parents in that role. That's not something that we see in all countries, right? You see, well, our public policy is about improving schools, which is obviously important. But at the same time, we need to support parents. And next, we need to worry a lot about strengthening the home environment to assure the continuity of the learning process between the school and the home. Unfortunately, even if the school itself is a space of equalization of opportunities, there's a lot of inequality at home. So just think in any classroom, right? It could be in a poor school or in a rich school. Students will come from very different backgrounds and very different environments at home. In some cases, there will be a lot of books at home. In other cases, there will be zero books at home, right? And that makes a gigantic difference in terms of the experience of the child. So we really need to worry about that home environment. Need to worry about the parents, the support to parents. We need to worry, and like many rich countries do, of making sure that all kids will have textbooks and books to read at home, right? Something that sometimes is not part of public policy and has to be part of public policy. Because another key lesson of this pandemic is that we need to make sure that there's resiliency, that there's continuity in that learning process across school and home, because there will be another earthquake, there will be another natural catastrophe. Hopefully there will not be a pandemic, but we just need to be prepared. So here we do have a window of opportunity that has opened, right? Thinking about technology, about teachers, about parents, right? About the home environment, about strengthening schools to build the foundations of the learning that we need for the future. And when I say the future is not the future of 2030, 2040, actually the future is now. And let me close with one final element, is that we need to think about what's happening today in our schools. Many systems in low and middle income countries are just starting to come back, right? In the global north, the return to school has happened a few months already, or even starting the previous academic year. In many in the global south, no, that's just happening now. But the big challenge is that, okay, kids can come back to school and there's a joy of returning to school, but then there's the huge problem of what am I going to do now different in school? I cannot do what I was doing before. I'm receiving a 5th grader that has the competencies of a 3rd or a 2nd grader, right? So I cannot do what I was doing before, right? So there is a set of interventions that countries need to implement today in order to make sure that this generation ends up having the same competencies, at least, than the previous generation and the next generation, right? So despite in many, if you see in India, Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, Philippines, Egypt, so all countries which have had school closures that could have been between 1 and 2 years, right? If we don't do something, then there will be a permanent scar on this generation, and that's what we need to avoid. To avoid that, first of all, we need to measure learning, right? Countries and schools need to measure where kids are and need to have formative assessments such that the teacher will know where each kid is, understanding that even within a classroom, the experiences of different children would have been completely different. So children are at different levels, and teachers have to adapt to that. And then once we have that information, it's a combination of interventions that have to do with prioritizing the curriculum. We really need to streamline and define what are the fundamental issues that we need to consolidate. We might have to expand instructional time, but more importantly, we need to make the classroom teaching process as effective as possible, right? We need to implement remedial teaching strategies, right? We need to support teachers, right? To implement those strategies. We need to teach students, right, at the level that they are today. So we really need to be much more effective and impactful. So it's not a matter of just returning. It's not a matter of just say, okay, so let's compress, right, 2 years into 1 or 4 years into 3, right? I mean, that doesn't require just a compression. It requires a real well-planned strategy, right, such that we prioritize and we make the teaching process much more effective. And this will really require a lot of support to teachers, right? We cannot just say, well, teachers will figure it out. No, teachers will really need support in order to make sure that they pursue the right strategies now that these kids are back to school. There is a sense of urgency still in many countries to accelerate the return. We don't see that everywhere. We see some countries moving slow, others are moving faster. But it's not only the return to school, it's then have a plan to do the right things now, today, urgently, right, at school, if we want to make sure that we don't leave a permanent scar on this generation. So it's a huge homework for all of us, but it's something that is critical that we do if we want to make sure that we give a right future for our kids.
Thank you very much, Jaime. That was really informative, and let's hope that our learning poverty will indeed become zero in time. We can only hope. So we're going to move on to because of our time, we won't have time for questions on this one, but we're going to move on to our next speaker, which is Mark East. And Mark East is joining us. He is the Worldwide General Manager for Education from Microsoft. And Mark, let's see if we are ready. Yes, here's Mark. We're very excited for his presentation about how technology bridges the gap. We talked a little bit about that already, and let's see a little bit more through the lens of Microsoft. So thank you very much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Hopefully you can see my slides here.
Yes, if you just make them big at the bottom, that's it. Great, perfect.
Okay, great. Well, it's really good to be with you. It's quite late here in Dubai for me, but hopefully I'll be motivated and enthusiastic in my usual way. I wanted to call this short presentation Build Back Better. I know it's a terminology that's already used by Joe Biden and Boris Johnson. I think Boris Johnson probably would claim he thought of it first, but it does really, I think, adequately summarize what we have to do in education after the pandemic. Now, I've been in technology now education technology now for 40 years, and this slide probably does pretty much articulate how I've seen things. Now, I've got my own personal views of why this might be, that education's always been following technology, but because of the interest of time, I won't share them with you today. I will, however, talk to you about looking at the different sectors and trying to understand it. So if we were to look at financial sector, they have hardware support. Anyone working in finance, they get software support. They have typically systems administrators. They have help desk when they need it. There's infrastructure support if the Wi-Fi isn't working. You know, they typically have a good deal of technology support. And then if we look at what typically happens in schools, the teacher is very much the IT department. They may have one or two teachers that understand technology, but typically we're expecting our teachers to be technology gurus, to manage all of the hardware, manage all of the software updates, and at the same time learn how to use technology effectively in teaching and learning. So how do we really bridge this gap? And I think it's going to be a combination of two things. First of all, new technology. And secondly, new mindset by the leaderships, both at government level and school leadership, in how we effectively empower these teachers to use technology effectively and efficiently to improve student learning outcomes. Now, I just want to give you a few examples of how technology really helps. So first of all, with teachers, obviously there's a huge time efficiency using technology. I'm going to cover that a little bit later. But one thing I found that is particularly a fantastic opportunity is in-service teaching. So where you have teachers out in the schools, how do you maintain their levels of professional proficiency? How do you train them, for example, on how they could be managing a disruptive student in a class? It's not just about technology training, it's training and updates and information all of the time. If they have the technology, you could certainly use the technology for training to all of the teachers in a country effectively. What about students? Well, when I was a student, I think certainly I didn't have a computer at the time. And in fact, I did have textbooks and I had a small library in my school, but that was the restriction of content that I had. I couldn't contact a teacher, an expert in the world, and get them to provide a lesson. And by the way, that lesson could be to hundreds of thousands of students all at one time. So you have economies of scale there. I couldn't do any of that. So students really have fantastic opportunity. Policymakers. Well, one of the biggest challenges I've always found when I've worked with governments is they said to us, well, demonstrate to us that there is student learning outcomes through the investment of technology. And it's always been very difficult to do, because to do that scientifically, you would have to deny students from technology and then provide students with technology and then measure that outcome. So you can't really do that. However, with cloud technology now, this collection of data has become much, much easier to do. And we can actually provide real-time feedback, both to parents and policymakers and teachers, and very, very quickly. And with parents, well, one of the key things is, how do you get more involved in your children's learning? I mean, one of the big frustrations for me with all of my three children was, I didn't really know what they were working on at any one particular time. Unless I went to a parents' evening at the school and they told me what, typically looking back on what they've done, I would love to have known what they were focused on at that particular moment. So in the times that I did spend with them, I could actually help. But of course, we couldn't do that. But technology allows that. So we've just gone through, this is Satya Nadella, our chief executive, and he would say that we've just seen 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months. When we first started out, all of the speakers before me have talked about this dramatic use of technology. It's basically because there was no other choice. I remember I was at University College Cork about a month ago, and the vice provost there said to me, look, really, Microsoft Office and 365 and Teams has saved us. If it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have been able to survive. And he said when the pandemic struck and they had to shut the university down, he said he had 1,200 members of his staff in a meeting the very next day using this type of technology. So we know that really it's helped save many education institutions, but at the same time that it's been very, very dramatic in terms of technology usage. And the interesting thing is, we believe that we're going to see even faster technology innovation in the next 10 years than we saw in the last 40. So this technology innovation is just going to keep on accelerating. This was a report from the World Economic Forum, and basically, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody, but it basically says, look, there's no going back. The bubble has burst. We know now that we can use technology very effectively, not just within learning, but also in the work environment. It's been proven. We can do it. We can use technology. This is more of an education focus, and it talks about how really for a lot of teachers and students, really they've been working within these what we call squares on the screen. They've been watching their computer, having lessons, and during that time, we know that, as has been said by many of the other speakers, that we've witnessed a real great loss in learning. In fact, 97% of all teachers that were surveyed said that they'd seen a loss in learning. And the important thing is that 70% of those teachers felt that they were really concerned that they didn't really have the skills to deliver high value learning using technology. That was a big concern of theirs. They weren't ready for that. They weren't ready for the change. They had the technology in a lot of cases, but they didn't really feel they were being very effective with it, other than just talking into their computer screen. And at the same time, they all believed that through the pandemic, they've seen that the future of using technology, 85% have seen that they can actually really start using technology in a much greater way. And only 7% of the students said that they felt that it really didn't benefit, that technology is not going to benefit them. So I think we have a changing mindset now within the teacher community, that technology is important and it can be adequately used going forward, even as hopefully we actually reduce the infection rates of COVID around the world. Now, most of you we've been using Teams actually on this call today, on this presentation. And one of the key things is that these 4 squares on a screen can become quite tiring, especially if, like me, you do about 15 of these calls a day. But the great thing is we're bringing new technology all the time. This is this fast pace of innovation I was talking about earlier, and we are bringing avatars to teams. And in fact, the avatars will be with us within the next few months. And you can then start doing some really interesting things. So first of all, you don't have to appear on the screen. Your avatar can appear on the screen. Your camera can be, you can be doing other things around the office, and it's your avatar that's actually in the Teams meeting. You can create these virtual areas. So here you could see sort of bottom left on the screen, students meeting in a virtual area within a campus or in a school. You could actually have a virtual classroom that you could build, and all of the students' avatars could be in the classroom. So effectively then, with wearables, you could be turning to your right and see your best friend sitting next to you at your desk. Or teachers could actually be using whiteboarding virtually, as you can see here with the avatar. So there is a greater richness coming to hybrid learning or remote learning in the future, which hopefully would take away some of that fatigue that we often get just by looking at the screens and presenting PowerPoint slides. This is an interesting survey that came from Stanford University, where they were looking at the fact that reading fluency in early grades were 30% lower. I think this supports what's already been said before. I just want to give you an example of how technology can help here. So a teacher typically, when they're checking reading progress of a student, will have a stopwatch, and then they will pass a piece of text to a student and ask them to read it. They start the stopwatch and they time them. They time them on the speed, they time them on accuracy, that they're actually reading the right words. They time them on and check them on pronunciation. They check them on whether they're pausing at commas and stopping a sentence where there's a full stop. And hopefully during that passage, they're making notes and getting all of that down. Now, typically when they do this, they have to leave the classroom. They typically would do it in the corridor because they don't want their student to be disturbed by all the other students in the class. And a lot of times the students don't actually like reading to their teachers. They find it a bit difficult and uncomfortable. So in August this year, we introduced something called Reading Progress. It's a free application that comes with Microsoft Office 365 and Teams. And this is what you can do with it. So you would basically, a student will be assigned a piece of work. It could be a PDF file, or it could just be a Word document. And she will be asked, or he will be asked to record it. So they will record themselves reading a piece of text. And once they're finished with the video, they can play the video back and they can listen to themselves. If they're happy with it, etc., they can then post it back to their teacher. Now, what the teacher gets is that there's artificial intelligence built into this tool. So the teacher gets all of this fantastic analysis. It will tell them that there was 41 correct words a minute. That's what their reading rate is. Their accuracy rate is 83%. It will tell them how many mispronounced words there are, where they've omitted words, any self-corrections they've made. And they provide all of this information back to the teacher on this particular student. They haven't had to leave the class. They haven't necessarily had to stand in front of the student and get the student then to repeat the text to them. And what's more, they get the data from all of the class, so they can start to see what typical words all of the class are getting wrong. So this is an amazing piece of technology that we've produced, which is free. And it really, really helps students, and it helps teachers save time because they don't have to go through one by one. They can just assign the work to the student, and as long as they have the technology, then they can actually do the work themselves, and the teacher gets all of the reporting. Now, looking ahead, we spoke to we have these innovative schools. We work with them, and we did some research with them, and basically, it's not surprising. But these are the most innovative schools, by the way, but our most innovative schools are saying they're going to increase technology professional development by 77%. They've learned that they have to do that. They're going to make sure that they do more to try and help the students catch up. 77% of them said they would do that, of course, using technology. They're going to develop more methods and tools to get data back, get the information back. And they're going to continue with blended learning going on. So they're not just stopping it now that the students are back in the school, they're going to continue this. And one good example of this, perhaps for teachers, is there's this notion of flipped classrooms. And a flipped classroom is where you say to the students, go and do this assignment at home this evening. and then send it back to us once you've actually done the assignment. And then tomorrow in the lesson, rather than me marking it, we're going to talk through it, because the system had already done all of the marking. We can start talking about all of your responses, and the quality of teaching in that type of environment is far, far better than the traditional way that we're doing it today. And also 69% will be will pay more attention to developing social and emotional skills. And I think this social and emotional skills has been a big thing that's come out of the pandemic. More care, social care, I think, is really important, and we're going to have to develop more technology to support that going forward. Now, another area which I wanted to just focus on a little bit is curriculum. For myself, I don't really believe that continued investment in books is very worthwhile. They cost a lot of money. Typically, computers nowadays can cost between $250, $300 for an entry-level computer, which has a camera, sound, etc. You can do most things with it. And so you can have as much content as you like to be read on that computer. And this is a work we've been doing with the New Zealand government. We actually created an education services group because a lot of governments were saying they wanted us to work with them to actually redefine education for them, work with them on their digital transformation. And this is just one element of this, where we're actually creating this content hub, where we have all of the different curriculum pieces. Teachers can actually evaluate it and give it marks, just like if you went up and purchased a book online and wanted to get some feedback from others. And so you can actually go up here, you can then pull that content down into your learning management tool. And parents have access as well, by the way. So getting to the point I said earlier on, you can start participating. You actually get guidance on what your child is working on at this particular time, and you can access all of the curriculums. This is something we're working on right now. It's quite fresh and new, but we think digital content managed and packaged in a really easy way is the way of the future. So what's driving all of this? Why do I say new technology is going to be the big change? Well, powerful algorithms and compute power, that's just where technology is getting better and better. So let's discard that for a second. It's really cloud and artificial intelligence. We've seen already the artificial intelligence being used with the reading progress application. But big data is where you can now start collecting data and get immediate information about a student's learning, so you can intervene. I mean, typically teachers don't get that information back to maybe the end of a year, and by then it might be too late to intervene in a student's learning. We can actually deliver that information to them regularly, all the way through a student's learning progress. So we generally believe that, now that schools are returning, and generally in many places they are now all returning, it's not really an opportunity to extend learning beyond the classroom. We think it's an imperative to extend learning beyond the classroom. Let's not go back. Let's try to encourage all schools and teachers to continue using technology for the savings it gives you in time as a teacher, the added value it brings for the teaching and learning process for students. I agree that it doesn't, replace going to school and meeting your friends and having that sort of cohort of togetherness that you get within school, but it certainly enhances learning in many, many ways. So why do we think that this is really quite important? Well, we know that in the future, half of all paid work will be automated by machines. There is going to be a dramatic change in employability requirements for the workforce. And so getting students used to using technology for things like computational thinking, problem solving, collaboration with other students, all of this really is supported by technology. And it's really important for them to be using that. Certainly for the new jobs that are going to be created in the future, it's those types of 21st century skills that we really want them to learn and know. And then we know that there's 149 million new technology jobs by 2025. In fact, Satya Nadella, our CEO, says there probably isn't going to be a job, that there isn't going to be some requirement of technology, digital efficiency in that role. So you need to be proficient in using technology, comfortable with it, because it's actually going to be involved in all jobs going forward in the future. So Microsoft, our mission is to empower every student on the planet to achieve more. We work with governments and educational establishments throughout the world. My particular region is Europe, Middle East and Africa. And we look forward to working with all of you going forward to try to see if we can improve student learning outcomes. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mark. Wow, just like Jaime's presentation, it's just filled with what's coming with the future, and we hope it's going to be bright, especially with avatars, it looks like. We might have time for just a quick question for Jaime. I'm going to go back to you just a little bit, just in less than a minute. It's a hard question, but one question popped up. Do you think that poorer countries will make it in the end to help our generation, this generation? Will we see this catch up? What is your view? Less than a minute. Hard question.
In terms of poor countries?
Yeah, do you think that poorer countries will make it in the end to help this generation? One question came about here.
It's actually it is both poor countries and middle-income countries that have been hit by this pandemic. This is not one pandemic that has hit poor countries only or poor countries more. Middle-income countries, which were unequal to start with, right, have been really hardly hit. So it's both. I mean, I wouldn't say that, look, I mean, the Colombias and Indonesias of this world were less hit, right, than the Ugandas or Malawis of this world. No, that's not true. However, in poorer countries, the challenge, learning poverty is higher, and the challenge is higher. So everything that we're doing in terms of this combination of the human factor and technology actually applies to both. Actually, it applies to both. It's harder to create a system in poor countries, but actually is essential. And I do agree with the point that it's not only an opportunity, right, but it's something that we really need to do if we want to see hope in the coming years.
Perfect, thank you. Mark, less than a minute. We have a quick question here before we move on. What was the reception of the new tool for reading from parents? We sometimes find resistance from parents when it comes to tools that record or video their children. Less than a minute, just a quick one.
Yeah, well, very, very positive. Ultimately, parents want their children to be able to read, and if they can actually see real value in it, and they can actually see the results going back to the teacher to help them develop that, they're very happy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So without further ado, we're going on to our next speaker. This is Andria Zafirakou, who is our Global Teacher Prize winner of 2018 from Alperton Community School, and also the founder of Artists in Residence charity. Would like to welcome Andria, and thank you. Thank you for being here.
Oh, hello everyone. Good evening. I'm very excited to be here, and it's been lovely listening to Jaime. Jaime, it's almost like I see you constantly at these events, isn't it? So you get Jaime, then I come free, I think. And it was just great listening to Mark as well. And I sometimes feel a little bit intimidated. What can a little teacher from a small community provide? Now, I'm actually having a lot of trouble, believe it or not, Mark, listen to this. I'm having quite a lot of trouble today trying to share my technology. So just bear with me for 1 second. Here we go. Can you see my screen? Is it evident? Yeah, it should be there. There we go.
Yes, it is.
Wonderful. Okay, so my presentation I'd like to speak and share with you today is the lessons that a tiny little teacher like myself from a small community in London would like to share about what I have learnt over the last few years. And it's been fascinating when we're talking about some of the countries who have really seen deprivation. And the last question that you had to Jaime was, would countries in lower income countries, would they ever get back on track in terms of education? Well, you know, we've been hit in my school, and you know, we are struggling to get those students back on track as well. So it's not just you know, this is affecting every school, every child across the world. So what are the lessons learned? And I think the image here is is unique. It's I've just turned the other way, or I've started to look in a completely different direction. So to give you a little bit of background, this is my world. This is the students that I teach. I work in a school in Brent, which is in London, the borough, the city of London. However, it is the most deprived area in the UK, and many of our students experience high levels of poverty. It's a very, very multicultural society. We have 1,700 students who come to our school every day. But as you can see, it's a really happy environment, happy place. And I've been teaching there for 16 years. I teach art and textiles, and I'm also a member of the leadership team. And the one thing that I've learned since the pandemic is, God, how much I hated teaching at home, how much I hated teaching online. And I think Mark said those little boxes on the screens. I was the one who was pulling my hair out, simply because that is not why I became a teacher. There's something about the classroom, there's something about the environment in a school, seeing students, seeing their body language, watching them talk, watching them communicate, being present, being in that environment, that spirit. It's unique. And working in isolation has been an absolute challenge for me. And I was the one who, when I had to, when the school said, right, we have to go online, I was the one who was like, huh, what do I do? How do I do this? What's the answer? And luckily, a very good friend of mine is an ICT teacher, and so she, bless her, took me under her wing and guided me through how to use Google. Sorry, Mark, we use Google in my school, but luckily that did help us a lot. So the most important thing about the power of our schools is the fact that my job is not just to throw knowledge at them. That they can do that from a book, they can do that by looking at Google. It's about watching them develop into human beings. And again, what's the most important thing about the school? It's the culture which we have in school. So every single school creates, nurtures their culture. And I think that's very much underestimated and undervalued, because the culture is part of the community that you belong to. And some schools have got very rich cultures, and some schools have cultures whereby the vision is not very clear. But the school culture is what keeps our young people connected. It's what keeps them resilient, responsible, ready to learn, and human beings which somehow we all connect together. So that's the biggest thing about the power of the classroom, and how sometimes those environments are very hard to replicate. So what did we notice, and what were the challenges? So I mean, we've all spoken about this. First of all, the students who suffered were the students who did not have the technology, who may have had one phone between 6 students or 6 children at home, or they may have had a laptop, but it's a laptop that was centuries old, no access to Wi-Fi. So we noticed that these students automatically, they were disadvantaged because they couldn't access. And the thing about young people is that when they can't, 90% of them will give up. Students like to have routine. They like to have a timetable. That system keeps them going, keeps them moving forward. And I think by not having that, that's when we lost, and lots of learning and the gaps were created by that particular issue. And then next to that, the other students who we always seem to forget about are the students who are maybe a minority in our schools, but the students with special educational needs. So how inclusive was our learning techniques and the way that we taught? The resources that we just grabbed from the internet, how inclusive were they to engage all our students? Did we differentiate well? Was the quality of our resources there? And right on the bottom of the screen there, you have the most peculiar looking family made out of wood. But what I'm trying to demonstrate there is that the students who did have the parents, the stable family, the resources, the books, the opportunities, the support in that household, those are the students who managed to stay with us, who were engaged, who did well, who did very, very well actually, learning at home. However, what we found is that many of our students in our school, this isn't the case. That the students who did suffer from and who were experiencing domestic violence, and maybe there was no parent supporting them, these are the students that we found that just fell off the grid. And finally, it's that resources, isn't it? It's the quality of the resources and the quality of teaching. And I have to admit, I've been teaching for 16 years, but nothing ever prepared me for what happened. And, I've, over the last years, I've collected all those, all my resources and the way that I like to teach in the classroom, tweak them a little, but all of those resources, they didn't mean a thing. I could not use them in my classroom. I had to completely reskill, completely learn new ways of teaching, using different resources, different artists, different genres. And that was, for me, the best thing that could have happened. I completely came out of my comfort zone just by having to skill up and knowing that I didn't have the resources. So, we're back on track now. Hopefully, we're getting there. We're really now thinking, okay, let's just now close those gaps. Let's move forward. Let's see how we can make sure that teaching will always be great in the future. However, what is happening in our world? So I just thought that I bring these small clippings for you. So our teachers are leaving. Our teachers are resigning. They are leaving the classroom, and this is a huge problem, because if we have got this massive deficit of our young people, so I think it was 63%, which Jaime said, of students who are not able to read before the age of 10. If our quality teachers are leaving the classroom, who's going to look after those students? What is the future of our generations? Who are we going to employ? Which gaps? And then, if that's the case, then the quality and the size of that gap will increase. So what I think would be very helpful. Now, again, this is teacher voice, and what would be really important is if we had brave leadership taking place, and brave leadership at all levels. So looking at schools leadership, looking at systematic leadership, looking at government leadership. We need to have really brave leaders who are supporting our schools, helping us with our making decisions, providing us with those resources. If they say they're going to provide laptops, they need to be there, who are prioritising the young people. I found that decisions were made. We had to wait for a lot of the good decisions to be made, and many head teachers and principals just made them regardless. And I think that's what inspired me, just seeing brave leadership, seeing the quality of leadership, and for that I was completely inspired. The fact that we need to start tapping into our communities. Sometimes schools work in isolation, and I've noticed that I became stronger and I became more inspired and energized and enthused to do my job when I was working with a larger community of teachers outside my classroom, outside my school, maybe outside the country. So I really made sure that I connected and used the local community as well as the extended community. Our teachers need to have access to high quality ongoing CPD, and I think what I'm talking here is CPD that is provided by experienced practitioners who are teaching in the classroom, whereby we can really open our minds to learning from them. I don't think it's good enough to say now, oh, I've been teaching for 16 years, I know everything I know about teaching. No, that would be a mistake. So it's having that mindset of being open and really engaging and seeing what is happening in classrooms, in schools around the corner from you, what's going on, and how can we connect? How can we utilize those communities? Networks are spoken about. The opportunity to be creative. So again, being pushed out of my comfort zone, I had to really think creative. My students didn't have access to any materials at home. They didn't have access to pencils, to paper. So I had to think, what do they have at home that they can engage in, which can be fun, which they can be creative. And sometimes creativity just needs you to pause, to stop, and to think outside the box. And sometimes as teachers, because we're on a hamster wheel, trying to get through the day, trying to teach the curriculum, we don't have that time. So it's about nurturing and making sure that we provide space for creativity to occur. Time, I just mentioned time, resources. So again, those top quality resources. I mean, it's fascinating the amount. I'm quite lucky, where I teach, in the country that I teach, the amount of software and IT and resources that were just being thrown at me from every corner of the earth. I could access anything I wanted. that was amazing. However, sometimes I felt that it was a bit too much, and I wanted instead of me searching for the right material, and if there was a way it was streamlined, that would be wonderful. So it's just looking at resources. How can we make sure the right resources for the right types of schools are being used? Motivation. How do you motivate your teachers? How does this happen when they are teaching in a very different way, in a very different place, at home or wherever? How do you keep them motivated to be inspired to engage the young people? So, you know, again, that's something that we need to have at the back of our minds. You know, what is it that teachers need, want, should have to encourage them to drive forward? And I put the word challenge there because, as I mentioned to you before, I love that feeling of being thrown out of my comfort zone and having to find a different way to teach. I liked being challenged, but it's not just about me feeling challenged. It's about me being challenged by others as well. So making sure that we are open to sharing what we are teaching with others, that we are open to other people watching us teach, seeing us teach, giving us feedback. That our leaders are comfortable enough to challenge us and say, well, Andria, you know, maybe you need to think about developing this in your classroom. So are we challenging good enough to keep those standards in our schools absolutely high? And I just thought I'd pull out this quote. It made me, you know, I read it and it made me slightly uncomfortable about, you know, oh my God, they're judging teachers, you know, but I love the end. So the great teacher inspires. And I sat there this afternoon. I thought, actually, I love that. I love the fact that my job is to inspire, because that's exactly what I seem to do all the time. My job is to inspire. You know, my students can learn. They now have the skills from over the last 18 months to research, to see different ways of learning. But what they really need is somebody to inspire them to carry on learning, to have that love of learning. And so, you know, I kind of went on a bit of a tangent. I'm sorry if I'm going on a tangent now, but I decided to research this word inspiration. And I came across this particular definition, and I love the second part, which says the act of inhaling, the act of drawing in air or breathing. Oh my God, you know, if teachers are there to inspire, then that concept of teachers are helping that seed grow, that seed breathe, the future of the countries breathe, develop. Yeah, just let that sit there with you, because that exactly is the role of the teacher, to inspire, to grow, to help human beings become better, develop, and to breathe. And so I can be very modest here. I have evidence. But, you know, what makes you a good teacher? Well, I think for me, what made me a really good teacher, I felt that I was a great teacher, is when, you know, during those dark days of the first lockdown, when that appalling incident happened, and where the rise of Black Lives Matter was born, out of nowhere, my students, or some of my students, reacted, and they reacted by producing these posters, their response to how they were feeling about the issue of Black Lives Matter. Now that for me, you know, we say that our job is to inspire. Well, if this is not inspirational, if this is not bringing that circle round, you know, the fact that our young people can inspire us with their knowledge, which gives us energy to then inspire. I mean, I think that that's quite powerful. So in our classrooms, what do we need to do? Yes, we got the knowledge, we've got the curriculum set, but how do we deliver, engage? Now, if you think about it, we need to close this gap, but does the gap mean just doing more tests and teaching in the same way? Some maybe that works, but for the majority, we probably need things. So first of all, it's about how can we make sure the way is aspirational, that every single child will achieve. That it's not good enough for our teachers to say, well, you know, the whole family came from that council estate, the whole family didn't do well, so he's not going to do well. No, that's wrong. We need to change our language. We need to make sure that our young people aspire. And I can't really quite remember the figure that Mark said about, you know, how many jobs in the future in 2025 will be technology, will be based on technology, but our young people need to have aspiration to know that they can get one of those jobs. And the way to do that is to think about how can we make our lessons more imaginative? How can we use our imagination to really make sure we grasp those young people? Feel, interesting word, right? We've, you know, for the last 2 years, it's like, don't touch, sanitize your hands. But maybe we need to start thinking about how can we re-feel? How can we get them to have that sense again of touch, of connection? Questioning, you know, we can only, I know some of the awful things that happen in some of the houses of our young people, and you know, and you don't want to question, you don't want to even let your mind go there, but our schools and our lessons have got to be places where they feel safe to question, feel safe to ask, but why is this happening? Why should this happen? And teachers need to be in a really comfortable position to be able to help explain that and help solve some of those ideas which young people are struggling with. Isn't this what school's about? Joy and play, right? I mean, you know, we can close the gap, and we can close it by remembering that having fun, playing is such a great way of learning. You know, if I was to say to you, when was the last time you had fun? Many of you say, oh, it was this and it was this, it was this. But if I say to you, what did you eat yesterday? You probably forget. So it's about making sure that never to underestimate the learning energy which joy and play can give. It's good to talk. I've noticed that some of the issues which my young students have, that they're, you know, just talking well, talking articulately was a problem to them. They were speaking in their own languages, and sometimes they're forgetting words and diction. So I think it's you know, making sure that opportunity to communicate is always effective in schools. Creativity I've mentioned, and I've highlighted this twice simply because I think this is something which we need to, as educators, really focus on. And this is the power of making sure that the resources that we're using, the people that we are teaching, the theories that we are teaching, our young people can identify with, that they can see themselves, their cultures within this. If they don't identify with what's happening, what they're learning, they will not connect. And it's quite fascinating. I spoke to a student of mine yesterday. I was looking at her book, and I asked her, so why do you enjoy this particular subject? And her answer was, because my teacher, he makes sure that whatever he teaches is really relevant to what we're doing in what's happening in society and what's happening in our community. And I'm able to identify with that. And I thought, oh my God, that's amazing. That's what's inspiring for our young people. Can they identify with who you're teaching and who they are seeing in the classroom? Kindness, yeah, it's been quite a challenging, tough world. So bringing back that and becoming that kind teacher is something that we should never underestimate. So I don't know if I've got time, but I'm just going to carry on a little bit. Is that okay? Just a few more minutes. This is a piece of artwork from a student of mine, and I'm bringing it back to the end of this presentation, simply because this is a student who really helped me get through quite a challenging few months. I taught her many years ago, and she was from Nepal when she first came to my school, and her work was tiny. She would only draw on the size of a stamp, and my challenge was, come on, draw big, you know, use the whole page. After 5 years, she sat her end of year examinations, her GCSE examinations, and she came into my room with this huge piece of wood. And she said, and I, you know, when I stared at her, my mouth dropped. I was like, oh my God, are you sure? She said, Miss, I'm going to go big for my examination. And so this is her final piece. This was her examination piece. And in terms of scale, it's 1 meter by 1 meter on a piece of wood, and it's hanging in my office. So that happened about 5 or 6 years ago. And then during lockdown, she called me and she says, Miss, guess what? I'm going to appear on a TV program in the UK called The Great Pottery Throwdown, and what that is, it's a competition, a bit like the Bake Off. But this is a competition whereby potters and ceramicists, they compete. And there she was, my student, on British national TV. So if that wasn't inspiring and made you want to achieve and do your job better, I'm not sure what is. But just to reflect on what are the lessons that I've learned, and some of this, listening to Jaime, there is so much connection there. So first of all, we need to make sure that our schools are open, and students love being in a building with peers, with that routine. That is our priorities. Keep them connected with peers. The second thing is that teaching is an art form that we need to be able to change. We need to be able to respond to adapt. And this needs to be always at high quality level. In terms of high expectations, we must stop and we must change our mindsets that say only this particular group of students will achieve and those won't. No, we need to make sure that everyone is equal in our classrooms, in our schools. Another thing is that environment is key for our young people. So what type of learning environment do they have? We touched on parents. Parents is a huge thing that we need to make sure that with schools, we need to connect them. Yes, the parents who can will support, but what about the ones who won't? How can we get them to engage with us? And I think that idea of closing the gap is not just about that knowledge gap of feeding them more knowledge and information. It's actually how they use it. So it's looking at how can we make sure that they're using their social and emotional skills? How are we building the characters of the future? The characters that will then have the skills, the resources to help keeping us joyful and happy, but also to make sure that they are thriving in this new world that we're living in. So I hope that was useful and gave you the perspective from a teacher's point of view.
Yes, thank you so much, Andria. It was amazing to hear and very inspiring as the word that you put across our screen. There's a lot of things to think about of what you said, and we have a few questions that we're going to give a few minutes for you to kind of think about and kind of talk to our audience. So one question that we have here is that a lot of students, one of our viewers has said, a lot of our students didn't have access to devices. How did your school handle that, like as in digital devices?
Yeah, so we were told that a delivery was going to come of laptops from the government, but we didn't wait. We just automatically we made phone calls at home, who has, who hasn't. We got the computers from the classrooms, the laptops from the classrooms, and we delivered them to the homes. But that wasn't a good solution. But that wasn't the only solution, because many of these families did not have internet. So we tried to provide dongles as well. For some of these students, we opened up the school as well. We made sure that they just came in, and we had a small group of students who were always in, and these were the vulnerable students. So, but then the challenge was our young people didn't know how to use the devices. So again, it was taking them through that step and that one-to-one tuition, which was done over the phone. So I think the hours of phone calls that were made just went through the roof, but parents were really happy about that. They felt they were happy that the schools were connecting with them.
Great. And just in 1 minute or less, what did you find? Do you find there's a big number of tools out there that is overwhelming as a teacher? One person has asked.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think sometimes there's too much out there and too much of the same thing that's out there. And you feel quite pressured that you need to always know the next thing or be always on top of your game. So how do I cope with that? I just learn from the people who I have in my school. What are they doing? What are they using? What technology? Always going to conferences led by other teachers, so I can see what I can learn and pinch from them, what ideas we can steal. But yes, sometimes there is too much. But then again, it's been useful because we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. So it's an interesting challenge, that.
Good. Well, thank you so much for sharing all your insight and how life is virtually and back in the classroom. So we're going to move on to our last speaker, which is Natalie Wexler, who's the author of The Knowledge Gap, the Hidden Cause of America's Broken Education System and How to Fix It. And we welcome Natalie for our next speaker. We're just waiting for just a moment to see if there might be some technical difficulties.
And it's been said that Sweller's cognitive load theory is the single most important thing for teachers to know. And yet many, perhaps most, probably most, teachers have never heard of it. So why is it so important? Well, teaching grounded in cognitive load theory can narrow gaps between student groups and enable all students to achieve their full potential. So let me explain. Cognitive load theory and cognitive architecture can be sort of summarized in a diagram that looks like this. Now, these are not processes in the brain, or these are not places in the brain, they are processes in the mind. And that first box that says sensory memory, we don't need to worry about that. It just means if you don't pay attention to something, you're probably going to forget it. I think that's pretty obvious. But this middle box, working memory, is crucial. Working memory is that aspect of our consciousness where we are taking in new information and trying to make sense of it. And the important thing to know about working memory is that it is very limited. It can only hold maybe 5 or 7 things at one time, and only for about 20 seconds. And if we have too many new things we're trying to juggle in working memory, then our working memory gets overwhelmed and we forget them. And that burden on working memory is what is called cognitive load. So there is a way around this constraint on working memory, and that is that last box on the right, long-term memory, which is potentially infinite. If we can just withdraw items from long-term memory that we already know, we don't have to juggle them in working memory, and that frees up more space there for things like understanding and retaining new information. The trick is that, first of all, we have to get things from working memory into long-term memory. That's called transfer. And the best way to do that is by attaching some meaning to those things, maybe by explaining them in your own words to someone else, orally or in writing. And then we have to be able to retrieve the items we need from long-term memory when we need them. And that's retrieval. And the best way to ensure that we'll be able to do that is through practice. The more we practice retrieving an item, the more accessible it is to us. So that's the basic idea of cognitive load theory. It's also been said that knowledge is like Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. Now, I didn't invent that, but I think it's a great image. And it's really another way of saying that if we have more information in our long-term memory, we have more capacity to retain new information in working memory. Now, some children from more highly educated families are able to acquire more of this Velcro at home because their parents may use more sophisticated knowledge and vocabulary in conversation, or take them to museums, all sorts of reasons. But the bottom line is that some children are going to start out with more academic knowledge and vocabulary than others. And those students who start out with more of that Velcro keep acquiring more of it because that knowledge helps them retain new information, while others fall farther behind. This is something that's been called, particularly in reading, the Matthew effect. And that's a reference to the Gospel of Matthew, and particularly the part that says the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And this gap between the good readers and the poor readers increases every year that students stay in school, unless schools start building their academic knowledge and vocabulary, the kind of vocabulary that some students are able to acquire at home. And this is really the problem that I wrote this book about, the book called The Knowledge Gap, which both describes the problem and also talks about what we can do about it. So, what can we do about it? Now, there are some important findings that flow from cognitive load theory and that conflict with what most teachers learn during their training. So, one is having information in long-term memory is what enables students to, find the main idea of a passage or think critically. And teachers are often encouraged to just teach the skill of finding the main idea or thinking or critical thinking in the abstract, but those skills don't work that way. You can only think critically about a topic if you already have information about it stored in long-term memory. Another finding, quizzing students on information makes it easier to retrieve. This is a common form of retrieval practice, but often teachers are told, well, you don't have to worry about students knowing factual information because they can just Google it, and we don't want to waste time quizzing them on that information. It's actually really important to do that. It facilitates learning. When students don't know much about a topic, explicit instruction or storytelling works best. And I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. And lastly, student engagement doesn't necessarily lead to learning. Students can be very engaged, but they may not actually be learning anything. So more on those two things. When teachers don't know these things, instruction can unintentionally advantage students who are already advantaged. So more about that point, those 2 points about explicit instruction and student engagement. So discovery and inquiry-based learning, they're very popular among many teachers, but they're ineffective when students are new to a topic. This has been found with lots of research showing this. So students may have a good time creating a volcano, but what they may remember is how much fun they had creating the volcano rather than the scientific principles that they're really supposed to be learning about. So it's been said, if the learner has no relevant concept about the particular topic in long-term memory, the only thing to do is blindly search for solutions. Novices can engage in problem solving for extended periods and learn almost nothing. It's just too overwhelming on working memory. And that's from an article that is called Putting Students on the Path to Learning. So explicit instruction doesn't have to be just lecturing. It can be discussion and writing and give and take. But just having students try to learn about a new topic through their own inquiry really doesn't work very well. So how does this relate to literacy? Well, we draw on our background knowledge to understand almost everything we read. It may not be obvious, but that's what we're doing. So, for example, there's a strong correlation that's been found between general academic knowledge, like knowing the answer to in what part of the body does pneumonia occur, and general reading comprehension. And that suggests that to boost reading comprehension and learning, kids need to acquire as much academic knowledge and vocabulary as possible. And it's important to bear in mind that literacy is about much more than reading. All of these things are connected: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. They're all components of literacy. And where cognitive load theory enters into this is that listening and speaking are considered what's called biologically primary. That means they're easier. We don't have to teach kids how to listen or how to speak. It imposes less of a cognitive load. Whereas reading and writing are biologically secondary. They have to be explicitly taught, and they're harder. They impose a heavier cognitive load. So listening and speaking, when kids are still learning to be fluent readers and writers, listening and speaking are the most effective ways to build knowledge and vocabulary. Kids can take in a lot more sophisticated information and understand it through listening and speaking. So listening and speaking can build the knowledge that fuels those more difficult things, reading and writing. So to ensure that all students acquire the academic knowledge that can unlock their potential, the curriculum should connect all those aspects of literacy and go deeply into topics in social studies, history, geography, science, and the arts. Those are the subjects that have the most potential to build the kind of academic knowledge and vocabulary students need to understand what they're reading and to acquire further knowledge. And to minimize the Matthew effect, this knowledge building should begin in the earliest grades. Remember, that gap between groups of students just gets larger the longer we wait. So I'd like to talk for a minute about writing in particular, the potential power of writing. Writing can familiarize students with the conventions of written language, boosting their reading comprehension. Remember, written language is almost always more complex than spoken language. And if students learn how to, for example, use subordinating conjunctions in their own writing, something they may not be familiar with from conversation, they're going to be in a much better position to understand that sort of thing when they encounter it in their reading. Secondly, writing can develop analytical abilities because you're forced to connect different bits of information, decide what's really more important. And it can, for the same reasons, build and deepen knowledge. It's both a form of transferring information powerfully from working memory to long-term memory and practicing retrieving that information. In fact, it's so powerful it can compensate for gaps in background knowledge even at upper grade levels. But writing is the hardest thing we ask students to do. Remember, working memory is very limited in its capacity. And inexperienced writers may be juggling everything from letter formation if they're young, spelling, what words to use, how to organize their thoughts, the content they're writing about, and the peculiar syntax and vocabulary of written language. And all of that creates cognitive load, and dealing with this also creates stress, which imposes another burden on working memory. So what can we do about this? Well, we have to observe two principles that enable writing instruction to narrow gaps. First, embed writing activities in the content of the core curriculum to build academic knowledge. So not just a personal essay about what you did last weekend, but write about what you're learning about. And secondly, modulate that cognitive load that writing imposes by beginning at the sentence level. Now, I know of only one method that combines both of these principles, and that's The Writing Revolution, and I'm the co-author of a book by that title with Judith C. Hockman, who's a veteran educator who developed the method. I don't have time to really go into the method deeply, but can give you a quick example of one of the sentence level activities that it covers. It's called Because, But, and So, and it consists of giving students a sentence stem, the beginning of a sentence, about content they're learning, and asking them to finish that sentence with these 3 different conjunctions. It's also teaching them how to use these conjunctions, which not all students just pick up from their reading. So let's say you're teaching students about this man who's the early 20th century composer, George Gershwin. And by the way, this method is designed to be used across the curriculum and not just in English class. So you could give students the following sentence stems. George Gershwin is considered a musical genius because, but, and so. Each of these sentence stems requires them to retrieve a different kind of information from long-term memory and put that information into their own words, thereby solidifying that information in long-term memory and making it more accessible in the future. There are different ways that students could finish these sentence stems, but here are some examples. Because he captured the spirit of American life in his rhythms and melodies. But critics have identified structural weaknesses in some of his works. So many other composers have tried to emulate his style. Now, cognitive load doesn't stop at the sentence level. Even when students have mastered different ways of constructing sentences, writing at length imposes a cognitive load of its own. Did I say that already? What was I going to say next? And what helps there is for students to have a roadmap in the form of an outline. So this outline calls for them to write down first a topic sentence, and then some details that they want to include in their paragraph, and finally a concluding sentence. And once they've got that roadmap, it's a fairly simple process to transfer it and turn it into a paragraph, using those sentence level skills that they've learned to make the writing flow smoothly. So to sum up, students with more academic knowledge and long-term memory have more capacity in working memory to understand and retain new information. To narrow gaps between more and less privileged students, schools should build academic knowledge beginning in the earliest grades. When learners are new to a topic, teachers should engage in explicit instruction to ensure students retain important information in long-term memory. To boost literacy, the curriculum should go deeply into topics and connect listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Writing is potentially our most powerful lever for building knowledge and analytical ability if cognitive load is carefully modulated. And finally, a knowledge-building curriculum that begins early is our best hope for unlocking the full potential of all students and achieving educational fairness. And of course, all of these gaps have been exacerbated during the pandemic, with some students able to pick up a lot of academic knowledge and vocabulary at home, and others being deprived even of the opportunity they were getting to do that at school. So thank you for listening, and I hope that this has illuminated what the science of learning can do to help us narrow gaps between different groups of students. Thanks.
And that was Natalie Wexler. We appreciate that great presentation. And we're going to close with some closing remarks from the founder and president of Sofia, the School of the Future International Academy, Konstantinos Doukas. And we welcome him to close our Bridge the Gap.
Hi, everybody. I think I'm sharing my screen. Everything's okay, right?
Just a moment. I'm not seeing anything yet.
Now you're ready.
Great, got it. Thank you.
Great. Wow, such a great summit. It's amazing how many super presentations. I'm really honored to be closing this great night, this amazing presentation from all these speakers. We had 6 very fruitful presentations that really showed us how well our participants are probably prepared to see their next steps that they're going to follow. So let me start making my presentation. I don't see it moving. Give me a second. So I will start with the first presentation by Margaret Andersen, that she talked about defining the problem. We realized that 94% of the world's student population was affected by the COVID and the pandemic, and we're expecting an increase by 25% of the children that have been below in proficiency levels. So learning quality will increase, and with the most disadvantaged children and youth facing the largest learning deficits. She's using a very nicely structured approach for how we can improve learning and equity in education with three pillars: parental engagement, when you shift business as a user, instruction, education, technology. What we see in parental engagement is that we're giving parents actionable guidance on how to be involved in their children's education and increase learning. So what we have to do is we have to train the parents. We have to properly involve them. They were in the classroom during the pandemic and during online learning. Parents were in the classroom. They were from home. They were watching what's happening in every classroom. So we cannot leave them out now. We must engage parents more. We must realize that during online learning they were there, so we have to keep them. Having them as allies sometimes might be difficult, but it is very important that we can increase learning by having the parents as allies to this approach. And we also must systematically inform the parents about their child performance, because it's proven that this increases learning. Shifting to business as usual instruction is something that we understand it's not a matter of quantity, it's a matter of quality. Every time we add something, we must accompany it with a change in pedagogy and support it with the right pedagogical software. And tailoring instruction in learning levels is the most cost-effective way to improve foundational skills. It was said very clearly, it's not that we have to put it at egg, it's how we use technology education in order to incorporate it in the classroom. Tony Wan made the presentation about the new virtual reality in education. And it was a very strong statement when he said that it was the biggest experiment in education when everybody went online in just 24 hours. It was not a strategy. It was not something that was designed and was just getting ready to prepare. It was something that was forced by the pandemic. And we learned a lot of things from that great experiment that we must very much study and fundamentally shape the future of teaching and learning. Many turn to existing platforms to keep it instruction going and using digital tools that already existed. Some other ones started creating new activities. It was easy to use activities that already was translated online, but it was much more difficult when you have to design something new, something different, especially for the younger ages. And the most difficult part was to keep students engaged. It was really difficult. Mental wellness suffered significantly, and teacher burnout, stress went through the roof. But technology also enabled vital human connections and social experiences working against the lockdown emotions, because even though people were at home, by using technology, they had the opportunity to connect, communicate, and exchange experiences and ideas, and also discuss about what they had, not just for schooling, but also for their lifestyle. As COVID continues, we have to see how students and families will react. We have a different attitude. Now, more and more students, families want and will have more options for how, when, and where they learn. Families want remote learning as an option. They don't want it to get vanished. And for some students, remote instruction works better and helps them connect with their peers for educational reasons. And teachers feel also better now because they feel more equipped to teach effectively with technology. Many schools are already making live online support available to all students with different kinds of scenarios. And in higher education, we see that it will expand the quality of learning, but also connect better to new economic opportunities. Traditional colleges and students are turning to third-party online courses to make more and more online programs. But we still see a big mismatch between what universities teach and what kind of employees businesses are looking for. Moving on to Dr. Saavedra's presentation, it was really astonishing when we saw that, before the pandemic, we had 53% that could not really understand a simple text by the age of 10. And this is growing. Learning poverty is going down in a very small pace. And there is a morally and financial, this is morally and financially unacceptable. The pandemic increased the learning poverty and can become the worst education crisis if we don't act fast and accurate. It was really interesting, this chart that Dr. Saavedra presented with all these numbers that really makes us think more and more how fast we must act, how accurate we have to be in the policies governments will have to take in order to be able to not have this pandemic be the worst crisis in the century. This generation is experiencing large learning losses. 60% higher losses on students with families with lower educational backgrounds and low income. Much larger losses in younger ages. We all know that how difficult it is to have, pre-K and primary students, early primary year students are going online. So what does this create? We have to find ways to close the digital divide. We also realized by the pandemic that education is a social phenomenon and learning is a social activity. So we need a balance between technology and the human factor. And we also have to understand that parents have a key role in their kids' learning, so governments must provide policies to support parents and also strengthen the home environment. We must accelerate learning recovery, so this generation will not have a permanent scar. It was very clearly said, and we need to implement a complete strategy in every country and every school. This chart presented by Margaret East is really very interesting. Technology is our main tool in the new era and can be a big help in designing and creating a complete learning environment for our students, their teachers, and also their parents. This chart presents very useful tools that help us understand what each stakeholder must and should do in order to support a good learning environment. And you can imagine how we can connect all these different tasks and create different kinds of activities. It is a very dynamic environment, and if we can connect that, I'm sure that the learning outcome will be very productive and very strong. We also saw how COVID-19, through this World Economic Forum numbers and presentation and research, has said some things that they are very clear now. Blended learning and working environments, it's going to be a blended scenario. We'll never go back to what was happening before the pandemic. And the COVID-19 pandemic busted the myth that working from home is not training, and training on home is not practical or ineffective. It can be practical and it can be effective. But we're going very fast to something that I believe is very important and very good for our students. Personalized solutions and going away from the one-size-fits-all educational model. By using technology, we can create really personalized learning. We see here how the plus and minuses of online learning. We see the red ones and the blue ones. But I was struck by the 93% of students who believe that digital learning is useful. And I believe that students always say the truth, and from students we can get the best outcome because they're the best judges. Top priorities for the school leaders to increase technology and technology skills and digital skills, develop more methods and tools, and also the most important, 69% say we'll pay more attention to developing social and emotional skills. Andria was once again amazing. I was so happy, the winner of the Global Teacher Award of 2018. I was very happy because I was there. I was during the conference there, during the global conference, and I saw it live. And the day before, the night before, actually, I was with her parents and we're discussing and saying we're gonna win. And I was really proud, as a Greek, having Andria to win. And as always, she's so inspirational, and she gives us those very strong messages about what is great teaching. We make and we support people, creating a place of fairness for conversation and address students' concerns. Be close to our students. It's not a matter of math and geometry and language or physics or whatever. It's being close to your students, supporting them, nurtured by having a sixth sense. I really like this sixth sense approach. And even though we understand that we have teachers under pressure, leaving the profession, and not, from what I know, there are many countries around the world looking for teachers. So what do we need to do? I believe that the list that Andria gave is really powerful. We need a brave leadership that will be supporting, coaching the teachers. We need to have a community. We need to have teachers connect outside the school. Strong professional development, networks, opportunities to be creative, and the resources and the motivation, the way we support our teachers. Teachers are the most important people for the society and the advantage we need from our society. They are a major piece of a very important puzzle. And that's why we should have the teaching profession on a very high appreciation standard. And she gave also some very nice points about what we should do. We should, first of all, make sure that we keep our schools open. And teaching is an adaptive art form and must be agile as teachers and creative. We must never forget that our students are all equal. And we support them by being happy, joyful, and becoming good people with empathy. And I kept this also by William Martha Ward that Andria mentioned, which is really strong. The mediocre teacher tells, the good teacher explains, the superior teacher demonstrates, but the great teacher inspires. Inspiring is really the word that was left behind from Andria's presentation very strongly. And then Natalie Wexler, she came, bringing the science of learning and how we can help narrow achievement gaps by using the teaching cognitive load theory, and how the working memory and the long-term memory work, and how we do these transfers and these retrievals. How quizzing students can really help on that. I really like the Velcro concept, and how when a student does not know much about a topic, you have to be explicit, and using storytelling and different kind of teaching methods, you can really help him in order to understand better. In order to boost learning, students need to acquire as much academic knowledge as possible, and schools should build academic knowledge in the earliest years. And in order to boost literature, we need to connect listening, speaking, reading, and writing, because listening and speaking build the knowledge that fuels reading and writing. A knowledge-building curriculum that begins early is our best hope for unlocking the full potential of all students and achieving educational fairness. That was her main point, and I really believe on that, and I really support it. Dear participants, Sofia envisions a world where education, through its continuous evolvement and transformation, will support every student to achieve his/her dreams and goals. In order to achieve this, you must first know where you stand and where you want to be in the next months or years. Sofia is an NGO that supports schools all over the world on their endeavor to become better, is donating to the world of education, to the community, to the education community. It's very efficient and a useful tool, the school self-assessment, that helps every school leader and principal to easily measure its school performance on every area of the school, and by prioritizing its future goals, find concrete actions that help them evolve. It's yours to use it. We're here for you to and we can support you on the use of this tool. And we hope that your road to excellence will be a road full of nice and dynamic and creative activities. I thank very much all of our speakers and also our great presenter. I thank all of you for attending. Stay safe, and we'll see you next year in Bridge the Gap 2022. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Konstantinos. That was an incredible, jam-packed, full of incredible information, wonderful summary as well for Bridge the Gap. And I hope that for anyone who would like to know how they can go back and look at this information, everything will be published. You can follow Bridge the Gap on LinkedIn, and the link will be sent out of these recorded sessions, so you can go back, review, and process and really digest all this incredible information, knowledge, and insight today. Thank you so much for joining us.